But really, the question sits there for you is do you understand what it means that you now work, or you've chosen to work in a regulated environment, and the implications that go with that, and understanding where you fit in the big picture. Sometimes it can feel like when you start to see some of the information that I'll present with you, that you might feel like you're floating in outer space a bit when you start to lay hold of the information that you are going to have to be able to deal with and come to terms with. Most of you probably are aware of your immediate connections, the people that you immediately deal with. So I'm going to put you at the center of this this display, if you like, and then just branch it out from there for the connections that you're going to need to be aware of and become familiar with. Now, I'll say right at the start is most people don't choose to be plumbers, gasfitters and or drain layers because they think that it's going to be equal to university study, and maybe get a little bit surprised when they realize the information I'm about to give you actually impacts on you and that you have to become familiar with it. And the best thing I can recommend for you early in your training agreement is that you really do set aside regular times during the week, maybe an hour twice a week, and you'd need to discipline yourself to do this, to look at this material. Now, you're not going to be asked to memorize it all, but you do need to be familiar with it, and I'll touch on that, on the reason why a little bit later. But you do need to be familiar with it, at least know that these things exist, where they are, and how to get hold of them. Now, you're more likely able to, or if you can't see this, on the left it says your boss, and on the right it says ITO-Welltec. So your immediate connections really in your workplace are going to be with your boss and perhaps with the ITO and Welltec for your training. But as far as Welltec connection with you is concerned, it deals with the ITO, and we have a contract with them to deliver the training that we can. And your immediate connection, obviously, with your boss, with your employer, tells you what to do, where to go, and when to do it. Outside of that are other agencies, and around this ring, I've put in the PGDB, Plumbers, Gasfitters, and Drain Layers Board, pretty significant as far as our industry is concerned. Energy safety, also very significant as far as our industry is concerned in regards to gas fitting. We have EWRB, the Electrical Workers Registration Board, not necessarily directly related to us, but if you encroach into their territory, suddenly they become very important. The LBPB, eventually we'll use up all the letters of the alphabet, but the LBPB is a Licensed Building Practitioners Board. Again, not directly related to us, but there is an influence in particular work, the scope of work that plumbers and gasfitters will carry out that has a connection there. WorkSafe, the agency in which energy safety sits under. New Zealand Qualifications Authority, an organisation that deals with your qualifications and holds the information that you'd need, particularly later on when you may be applying for a registration level or just want to find out where you're up to with your, as far as your qualifications are concerned, unit standards and what have you, or any other higher qualifications that you might have, be registered there. And there's another little item there that you may not pick out so readily, is the police. It's another agency, not necessarily directly related to our day-to-day activity, but if the wheels fall off, and they fall off badly, and something goes wrong, the police do get involved. Now, in a former place of employment, was involved in investigating incidents, and where things had gone extremely wrong. I'm not speaking about, or not talking about the incident in Christchurch. It was a few years ago now, but it was a house was also blown up, and the police were called to and involved in that. Now, the police look initially to see if there's any criminal intent. If it's not a criminal intent, then it normally goes back to the other agencies that deal with it. But nevertheless, they sit there as an agency that you may, from time to time, have something to do with. Outside of that come other bits of information that you would need to know about, things like the Plumbers Gas Fitters Drain Layers Act, Electrical Regulations, Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act, Building Act, Building Code, Electrical Act, Plumbers Gas Fitters Drain Layers Regulations, the New Zealand Building Code, which I've just clicked in and brings you to. And then on the outer cycle are New Zealand standards. So even in the New Zealand Building Code, a bunch of different documents, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and you would need to know about these. Each one has their own sub-clauses in them. And the same for the standards. There's Australia and New Zealand standards and New Zealand standalone standards. If you start to stack these documents one on top of the other, and they're documents that you will be using. I mean, even the standards on their own, ASNZS 3500 starts at point 0, which is a glossary, just an explanation of terms and words that are used throughout the standards, right through to point 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're going to stack at least 200 mils high. Then you can put on top of that the building code documents, and there's probably another 200 mils high. You can stack on top of that things like the acts and regulations. So you're probably getting to a stack of books that getting as long as the length of half your arm, and you need to be aware of these. So these documents become quite important as they govern the type of work that you do. Now I'll see if I can just get out of this PowerPoint and into this one. So this is a PowerPoint I've just discovered just before this meeting. So I've got another one that I've been putting together, but I'll work through this one. We'll see how we go. The issue that sits around is keeping it legal and compliant, and all that information that I gave you before is really talking about the instruments that help you or guide you in keeping compliant in what you're doing. Now, remember I said it's a regulated industry. That means there's somebody who's actually watching what you do. Now, they're not physically standing around watching you, but they're an agency that's responsible for ensuring that you're competent to do what you do, and they're a place that people can go if they've got complaints about the type of work that's been carried out. If you didn't realise that, you wouldn't be aware of it. Let's go to this next one. So some of the reference documents, and you'll see the information that sits in your skills study guide that sits around the Plumbers, Gas Fitters and Drain Layers Act. The easiest way to get these, I've found, is just to hop onto Google and type in Plumbers, Gas Fitters, Drain Layers Act. And usually it'll get you there. It'll get you a site called legislation.govt.nz. Or also you can, I would always suggest the first place to go, because I know you can get it through the skills site as well, is to go through the board's website. You don't actually even have to be current for this information, but it does give you access to their legislation documents. But you must have a current practicing license to access standards, and it's a suite of standards there we talked about before, and they will always be current. And so you're sure that even if you go on a Google search, you may not actually get a current version of what you're looking for. But the Plumbers, Gas Fitters and Drain Layers Act, and then underneath that sits the regulations. The Gas Act, underneath that sit the Gas Safety and Measurement Regulations. The Building Act. Now there is a we call the Building Regulations. They're very small now. They used to be very comprehensive, but they're very small, and basically they've got a link in that tells you now go to the Building Code. the New Zealand Building Code. And the reason for that was the regulations used to be very prescriptive, and it was the only way you could do something. The Building Code allows some wiggle room for you. We'll touch on these things as we go a bit later on. The Health and Safety at Work Act is a general coverall for the type of things that you do, not only to keep you safe, but to keep others safe. And it actually has a major impact on people and the work that they're carrying out now, more so than if you go back a few decades when guys like Ron, one of the other fellow tutors, Paul, myself, those are getting a bit long in the tooth. You tended to get a kick in the pants and told, get underneath the house, boy, get under there and get it done. And it didn't really matter too much about safety aspects. One of the major things that they are concerned about at the moment and looking at is not just you fall over and break your arm, but the long-term health and illness issues with dealing with chemicals, glues and things like that. So you just need to be aware of it. There is legislation that covers that. Then there's a code of practice for industry. There's different types of codes of practice. This one here is for colouring and wording, etc. It's just an indication that there are different types of legislative documents. Now, I know I have been going pretty flat stick for about the last 15 minutes. What I just want to do is just pause for a moment and just, does anyone have any questions? If you just pop a question up quickly on the chat, I'll see that, mainly because I just want to take a break from speaking. Okay, thanks, Marty. I see that Marty's noted skills on access for standards and what have you, but the PGDB does. Remember, for access to it's a good indicator actually for that you've got a current practicing license. If you can't get access on the board's website to the standards, it's an indication to you that you're not holding a current practicing license. Either the funds haven't been paid, the information hasn't been provided, or your boss hasn't selected that he's going to be your supervisor yet. So the Plumbers, Gaskers and Drain Layers Act, it sets out the purposes to protect the health and safety of the public. It's not there to provide a protected trade for you and for me. It's there to protect the health and safety of the public and to ensure the competence of the people who are carrying out that work. That's written not by the board, it's written by Parliamentary Services. As we see, is to protect the health and safety of the public and ensure people who do the work are registered and or licensed, holding appropriate authorisation to do that work. That's written in a number of parts. Part 1, preliminary key provisions, restrictions on doing assisting work. Part 2 covers registration and licensing. Now, a lot of these things, that if you open it up, it's wonderful bedtime reading because it'll put you to sleep in about 5 minutes, unless you've got a particular bent for looking at this stuff. But you don't, as I say, you don't have to memorise all of it. But these first sections, part 1, are quite important for you to know and to understand. The rest of it, it's nice to know, and if you're going to have specific or particular reason for being involved in it, like an employer license, you wouldn't necessarily want to go there. Part 3 covers who it applies to, offences. One of the things that you, again, may not realise is that the board has power to take a disciplinary action against you if the wheels fall off. They have the power to apply fines and or apply a thing called a censure, which is effectively a warning letter, a very firm and formal letter. I'll just see a question that's popped up for Scott. I don't know if you can see that, Marty, but might pay to answer that one. It'll be handled later on as the answer to that question anyway. And then the last part, administrative and miscellaneous provisions. The big part of the Act is the front part, knowing that the purpose of the Act is to protect the health and safety of the public and to ensure the competence of the people that are undertaking that work. The board's responsible for setting registration classes and the competencies for each of those classes for registration and licensing requirements, and as I said, carries out disciplinary and prosecution actions. And I'll just see if I'm able to do this. I hopefully won't mess the whole thing up, but you see at this bottom here, it talks about Gazette notices. We talk about Acts of Parliament, or the Acts, the regulations, codes of practice standards, but underneath the regulations and the Acts, it's this other thing called Gazette notices. Gazette notices are published, so the board comes up with these Gazette notices, got to go through a whole process, and then once they're approved by the minister, they can they publish these Gazette notices. Now the Gazette notices set out terms and conditions on your registration and your licenses. So I'll just see while we're there if I can pop that up. Marty, can you just pop online and tell me, can you see this?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. Yep.
Okay, you might have to help me if I've got to go back into that PowerPoint. But this is a notice of a Gazette notice, see at the top, and it lays out, I won't go through the whole thing, but it lays out the registration requirements for a certifying plumber, and it does so for a tradesman plumber and a journeyman as well, and then they repeat themselves basically with applicable information for gas fitting and for drain laying. And it talks about authorised work, what a certifying plumber is allowed to do, but also sets in place the competencies, and you need to know these. These are available, these Gazette notices are available on the board's website. Again, you don't actually have to have a current license to see these. You can get into the board's website, and I just put in the search engine Gazette notices, and I found these. And you need to know them because you'll need it to know it for your questions and your assessment, sorry. So it sets out the competencies of what you need to know, trade calculations, materials and their properties, etc. It also sets out conditions, what's required as far as supervision, ensuring that anyone they're supervising is doing what they're supposed to do and how they're doing that. So we can go back to that. Okay, so that was pretty good. The regulations sit underneath the Act. They're a very small document. I wouldn't spend too much time in there. The main implication that the regulations sit is about employer licenses, which is about gas fitting, and I would pretty much guarantee that most of you won't be involved in setting up an employer license, but at least you know that it's there. The registration and licensing requirements, which we looked at in the Gazette notice, and that's partly what you're are doing as you go through your apprenticeship and through your training agreement, learning the competencies and the theory information, but you'll also be required to do some further study on your own once you've completed the New Zealand certificate as you make your way through from registration at tradesman level through to certifying level. Another key thing that you need to pick up on, need to understand, and again, it's not a good idea. Remember, you're in a regulated industry, so that means it's law. It's just like it's law to have a license if you want to drive a car. It's not a good idea if you got pulled up by the policeman and you don't have one, telling the policeman that you thought it would be a good idea if you did or didn't, it wouldn't make any difference to them. You'd pay the fine accordingly. So it is for a for working in these trades, that you have to have authorization, and it's called a license effectively, and it starts, and you need to know this, so you should note it down. It starts from April 1 each year and goes to March 31 each year. Now that applies right across the board, apart from the employer license, which is a bit of a peculiarity and may get an extended license, but as far as everyone else is concerned, you just need to know it's an annual license. It's been that way for 40 odd years or more. So from April 1 each year, you should have a new license. Now the licenses, you're able to pay and set that up from about halfway through February and March each year, so that you can have that done and dusted by the time it comes to actually getting that license on April 1. It should automatically flick over to current. If you are working without a current license, it's deemed as being illegal, and you leave yourself open for potentially for prosecution and any insurance issues that may crop up for a homeowner on any insurance claims that relate to work that you may or may not have carried out while you didn't hold a license. It's deemed illegal. So you just need to be aware of it, that's all. Again, if you don't know these things, you can blithely, happily carry on, and then suddenly something happens and you find that's when you find out it's a little bit late at that point. The classes of licenses, it's probably a little bit tricky to see, but this information is available on the board's website as well. At the top of the tree, the certifying level, that person's responsible for you and all the work that you carry out and anybody that they are a supervisor for. Underneath that, it's a tradesman. Underneath that are you guys with the limited certificate trainees, then exemption under supervision. A journeyman, the journeyman's a bit of a funny class that was brought out because people got stuck between finishing the national certificate and not having attained a pass in the board's registration examination. And so it allows them to enter into a registration class. What that does is it brings them, unlike the limited certificate or exemption holders, it brings them directly into or under the board's control as a registered person. And the provisional license holder, that's really for somebody who's making a transition from one stage to another and needs something provisional and it's not long term. So this is quite important for you to understand. It's a general guideline. It's not specific or detailed information, but you need to know it in general. Certifier is really responsible for everybody. And if you're working for your boss during the normal course of events, your normal daily activities is fine. But if you're doing homers on the weekend and he's not aware of it, then he may still be liable for work that you're carrying out. So you'd really want to have a good watertight agreement with your employer that he knows and has agreed to any and all work that you carry out, because he or she is totally responsible for that work. You look on that little card that's put out by the board. Again, it's just it's general. It's not specific or legal information. It's guidance as to what you can do. There are some specific information or specific things that get a little bit tighter. Excuse me. Effectively, as a trainee, you're allowed to test, but you're not allowed to test for verification purposes. That really needs to be done by a tradesman person or a certifying person. But the board recognises that and it wants you to be able to do it. So you need to be able to practice it and do it to get it right. So that's another guide that's there on the board's website. The Gas Act. Gas Act is another piece of legislation. Again, it's a law, and as gas fitters, you're actually bound by this and what it contains. It's to provide for the regulation of supply and use of gas throughout New Zealand, and for the gas industry, again, to protect the health and safety of members of the public, and to promote the prevention of damage to property in connection with the supply and use of gas. It has varying arrangements and authorisations, people that actually connect with this. The main ones that you're actually going to be connected with is WorkSafe. and it's the agency that you'll end up with is Energy Safety. Energy Safety work under WorkSafe. This is a big piece of document and legislation that you really do need to become familiar with. The Gas Safety Measurement Regulations. They really set out some clear terms, and this, if you note this down, the Gas Safety Measurement Regulations 4, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 and 14. So if you're taking notes, I'd really write those down. They give some very specific information about safe and unsafe, and to guide you through that, understanding exactly what it is. And one of the things that a lot of people get confused on is terms when something's not right, and you'll often hear, oh, it's illegal, it's illegal. What they really mean is it's non-compliant. The legality sits on whether the person is authorised or not to do the work. But as far as whether it's compliant or non-compliant, that then runs into the issues, is it safe or unsafe? And these terms are specific and they're detailed in the Gas Safety Measurement Regulations. Now, where it also kicks in another level is in Regulation 10. There is an obligation, and there's an obligation, and you need to know this, so if you take a note, write it down. You need to know the obligation if something is posing an immediate risk of danger to people or damage to property, then there's a responsibility to notify Energy Safety and to notify the owner or occupier that they've got to sell. They must notify the energy retailer, wholesaler supplying them gas, that the installation is unsafe and posing an immediate risk. Now, hopefully, in 99 cases out of 100, the consumer or homeowner is going to tell you, well, do what you have to make it safe, which may include turning the gas off. It may mean shutting down the gas supply to a particular appliance, tagging it, so it can't be used until that has actually been made safe or the situation's been remedied. But if it does meet Regulation 10, if it fits into that category, it's not a good idea. It's actually an obligation. Even if you fix it, it's still an obligation to notify Energy Safety and to follow those terms or the requirements in there. There's quite a bit to go through, and I know I'm speaking quite fast through this, and I see there are questions that are popping up, and that's quite good. You've popped those up. Martin's actually answering them for me as I go on. I'll hop into the next slide, so I see some information coming up that again needs to link into for your online assessments. And the Gas Safety Measurement Regs again deal with testing certification requirements. If you make a note again, write this down, the Regulation 45 and Regulation 46 through to 52K going to deal with the certification requirements. Also, you'll see in there in the Gas Safety Measurement Regulations that the definition of low risk gas fitting, high risk gas fitting and general gas fitting, as their specific terms that's clarified or outlined in the regulations as well. You'll notice the reference in testing Regulation 45 refers to the Australian New Zealand Standard 5601.1 and .2. Again, it's a document that you'll need to become familiar with, and I'll touch on that a bit later. Also, the thing that we now have that we will want to be aware of, and most gas fitters are aware of it and will look for it with a gas appliance, and that's this authentication mark, the flame with a tick in it. If a gas appliance has got that on it, then you can, on reasonable grounds, accept that it has been through all the requirements it needs to be on the Energy Safety Appliance Declaration database, and it's going to be okay to install. Now, not all appliances actually have it, and they don't all have to have it, but by and large, that's the general rule that you work by. If it doesn't, then there's another set of rules that you go through, but you must go through them. And that information sits in the gas safety measurement regulations, and that's where to find to clarify that. But in general rules, you're just looking to see if it's got this mark. If it does, then happy days, you can move on. The Building Act. This one is a bit of a clincher that often people don't fully understand. It sets out the law regarding building work, and it really sets out the fact that all building work must comply. And building work includes plumbing, gas fitting, and drain laying work. So it's not just about 4x2s. And when it says that it must comply with the building code, or the intent to for people who use buildings that they can do so safely. Buildings have attributes that contribute appropriately to health, physical independence, and well-being. People who use the building can escape if the building is on fire or there's been an earthquake or something. And buildings are designed and constructed to be able to be used in ways that promote sustainable development. That's a bit of a new one added to it, so it's been there for a little while. But the building itself can't endanger your health because it's made of shonky material. But it also, as far as things like an earthquake, the building doesn't have to remain up and perfectly intact. It needs to remain up in a way that you can get out. Then you have to deal with it, with the issue of the building. But as far as the work that you do and that you have to carry out, then that would need to actually, if you follow the legislation documents through, there's an act. So underneath the act are the regulations, and the regulations, the regulations point you to the building code. And the building code sets out the requirements for the work that you do. There are different schedules in the Building Act, Schedules 1 and 2. Just to confuse you, in the Building Act it says all building work requires a building consent. Then it goes on, it says not all work requires building consent. For work that doesn't need a building consent, it's outlined in Schedule 1. So you have to then go find Schedule 1, which is right at the very bottom of the Act, and in there you'll find information specifically for plumbing and drain laying about whether it requires a building consent. Now, whether it requires a consent or doesn't, the work still must comply with the building code. So here we have a slide that's just outlining these building code documents, A through to H, that if you haven't looked at these documents, I'd suggest you go in to the building code. If you just Google search New Zealand building code, it takes you to a link that comes up with this, basically with this image, and you can open up any one of these clauses and have a look in them. We're probably most familiar with G because of G12 and G13, but each one of these has implications for the work that you carry out. So you need to be aware. If you pop into one of them, you'll find that it opens up and then details some more information. Like we say, for there's B1, B2, if there's a G10, 11, 12 and 13, well, then there must be a G1 through to 10 as well. So there we go, there's building code clauses through to G15. The ones we'll be most familiar with, probably as I just said before, G12 and G13, water supplies and foul water. There's also industrial liquid waste, solid waste. For gas fitting, there's G10 and G11, gas as an energy source and pipe services. You need to be aware of those as well. Now, this is a bit that you really need to be aware of. The building code is split into three specific sections. Now, when you look at the document, the building code, say G12, you'll have G12 has the mandatory requirements. You can't opt out of these, and they're called the OFPs: the objective, the functional requirements, and the performance requirements. They're vague to a point. They're quite brief, but they are a set of parameters that you must achieve. When you open up a document like what we would just see G12, the building code are these, the OFPs. Then it'll go on to give what you would see as AS1, an acceptable solution 1, AS2, VM, verification method 1 or 2, and on they go as is shown in the clause. The acceptable solutions are ways in which you can carry out the work that will achieve the requirements that are being asked for in the OFPs. So I'm not too sure. We're on our next slide, so we'll just see. In the fine print, you might find in any one of these clauses is reference to other documents, and so you might find that NZS 3500 is also included, a sort of a legal term, a legal word that may be used as cited. But that information sits in there, and you'd need to look and find where actually applies within that code. So basically, if you look at the OFPs are what you must achieve. If you look at the acceptable solutions, they are, if I do it this way, this is how I do it, it will meet the requirements of the OFPs. Looking at one of the objectives, G12, the objective of the provision is to safeguard people from illness. Doesn't really say how. Safeguard people from excessively hot water. Doesn't really say how. We would know now, having done plumbing for a bit, that you've got things like tempering valves, etc. And so those are in the acceptable solutions as to how they must be installed. We looked, I jumped over the objective, the function requirements, and jumped into the performance. Again, it's laid out there. And if you have a look at any one of those clauses, they will start with the OFPs, and you need to be aware of them, because ultimately if there's a complaint is laid through the investigation process, you go back and look at that and say, did you actually achieve this? Oops. Some more detail that sits there specifically. Well, there's some questions for you. I know that we've only got very limited time, and it's and I've been talking quite a bit, but there's quite a bit of information that we need to get through, so I'm going to actually push on. As I said before, about if you want to find out about the requirement to have a building consent or not, you have a look at Schedule 1, and it details that information that's in there. It's quite specific, and fortunately one of the heading starts up that even if it doesn't require a building consent, then the work must still be carried out by a person that's authorised by the board to do that work. But as I say, if you have a look at Schedule 1, and it's right at the bottom of the Building Act, and it's Part 2, so you'll have a look, scroll down, you'll find it, and there's good information there for you. So Health Safety at Work Act sits under WorkSafe. They say to provide a balanced work frame, secure health and safety of workers and workplaces. Again, if there's issues that crop up on a work site, and you know, New Zealand's doing a lot better now at protecting the health and safety of workers. You know, when I was on the tools way back when, got off the ark, you know, things like scaffold were hardly ever seen on a site. Didn't matter if the house was 1 story, 2 story, or 3 stories. It was usually some rickety 4x2 that was stuck up. Nowadays, that's could lead a person to prosecution if that's what they were doing, and a lot of the health or a lot of the benefits that we have now for working on safer sites is because of this act. And again, it's an act of Parliament, so there's people who administer it and can take action against people who are flouting the laws. The Health of Drinking Water Amendment Act, again, that's not something that plumbers necessarily would look at specifically or know about. You would tend to think that if you're hooking onto the council's water main or water supply, the water's going to be fine, but not everybody gets water straight out of a tap off the council main. You might have water that's being supplied from a bore, or even from rainwater, or from a stream, or from a private water supply. And as a plumber hooking up to that, you would need to be aware of this and to make sure that the water supply meets the requirements of the Act. Standards. This is actually the end of this PowerPoint. Standards, we looked at a suite of standards. I mentioned them earlier on. Let's see if we can flick through this. There's the 3500 series I mentioned through 0 through 1, 2, 3, and 4. Most people tend to deal with 3500.2. If you're doing a lot of drain laying work, will there be stormwater as well? But at your stage, you predominantly, in the assessments and the examinations, deal out of the building code, and we'd be dealing out of G12 and G13. So you need to be very familiar with those documents, as well as probably on site. You are probably, even if you didn't realise you were, you're probably working out of ASNZS 3500.2. As I say, they're big documents, and you need to get used to looking through these. If we were in a classroom situation or back at Welltech, I'd have those documents there for you, and I'd be requiring you to find certain things in those standards, in the Act, in the regulations, so that you would be physically searching your way through it. Now, for me, I'm much more used to working with paper than I am with a cell phone or a tablet, and I prefer to actually work my way through a printed version. Once I'm familiar with the printed version, then I'm very happy to actually navigate my way through on an IT device and work my way through that. But either way, however you like to do that, you need to be familiar with it. I just will go back to that if I can. That one there. This one, this gas standard in particular, and again, if you're taking notes, I'd note this. You need to be familiar with the layout of the standard. Remember, we've got the building code, and we have the OFPs, the objective, the function requirements, and the performance requirements. You can't opt out of those. All the work that you do must meet those. And it's the same when you hit the standard for gas fitting work. Section 1 is the scope and general information, and it gives you the scope of the standard and general information about it. Section 2 specifies the mandatory performance-based design and other central requirements, and the key word there is mandatory. Section 3 for 5601.1 and sections 3 to 9 for 5601.2 set out the means of compliance, or the acceptable solutions of verification methods that will meet the requirements of section 2. So it's like the acceptable solutions in G12. If you carry out the work according to what's in the acceptable solution in G12, you will meet the requirements of the OFPs. And it's the same for this. If you use sections 3 to 6 of 5601.1, you will have achieved the requirements that are outlined in section 2. You can't just blithely bypass it and not do it. Just as there is in the building code documents, it's just unfortunate because it uses the same letters. You have AS, which are acceptable solutions. You also have AS, which is alternative solutions. So if you're going to come up with some other solution other than the acceptable solution, you can do that. You just have to make sure that it's going to equal or exceed the acceptable solution, and that would need to be for plumbing and drain laying. That would have to be agreed on by the territorial authority issuing a building compliance document, so to say that you can actually go ahead and do the plumbing that way or the drain laying that way. And as far as gas fitting is concerned, if you're going to use a solution that is outside of section 3 to 6 or 3 to 9, you still can, but because you're the certifying, assuming you're the certifying gas fitter, the certifying gas fitter has to be satisfied that the work that they're going to do will either meet or exceed what is already written down, the acceptable solutions 3 to 6 or 3 to 9. Just in this case, because a gas fitting is self-certifying, there's no one else involved to check that. You have to be satisfied that it does. And if the wheels fell off and you were being investigated on it, you'd want to be able to produce the documentation that shows how you reached that conclusion or that decision. What else have we got here? That one. There are some of the links that were to that was to that information. I just wanted to touch on a couple of other things to see that we're pushing along in time, and to recap perhaps on it. There's another bit of information that sits in a thing called the TTMRA, which is a Trans-Tasman Mutual Recognition Act. That really sets up an agreement between New Zealand and Australia, so that if you go to Australia or an Australian comes here, you are entitled by that act to have equal registration in either country. But you don't just walk in the door and say, I'm here. You actually need to apply for it. You need to put the application in. You need to provide all the evidence and the information to support your application. And in Australia, there's about 7 different states, however many there are, and each one is slightly different. So if you're in New South Wales, you would have to make application to the applicable New South Wales authority under TTMRA, saying that if, say, you're a certifying plumber, that you wanted their equivalent of a licensing and registration at certifying plumber level, provide all that information, and then they would check that with the Plumbers, Gas Fitters and Drain Layers Board, and vice versa. So you do need to know about the TTMRA Act. One thing I'll note, and if you can write this down, because you'll see it in your skill study guide, it's not correct. It actually needs to be remedied. If you've got any questions that are in your assessment, follow what is there, because I think there is one that relates to this. You'll see a chart that relates to the interrelationships of stakeholders. By stakeholders, we mean the people who are involved in the industry, the plumbers board, energy safety, different organisations and agencies. That's who the stakeholders are. So you'll see this chart that's laid out with different boxes and underlaying different levels as they go through. You'll see in there that it says that the Plumbers, Gas Fitters and Drain Layers regulations and gazette notices sit under the Department of Internal Affairs. Well, they don't. They sit underneath the Gas Act, and the Gas Act is administered by the board, but it sits underneath the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. So you may want to just I'd encourage you to make a note of that so that you've got the right information. But if you ask a question in the online assessments that relates to that chart, unless you want to give a specific a note in your answer, that actually is correct. You'd have to follow what they say in their in the question and the assessment. I hope that we've given enough information for you. I'm pretty sure that I have, that I've covered some of the things that you would need to know. One thing I probably want to touch on too is just go back to the Plumbers, Gasfitters and Drain Layers Act. In there again, there's information that covers things that have the potential to affect you, like laying a complaint. So anybody can lay a complaint. It's not 100% correct because the board or board members can't actually lay complaints themselves. But apart from them, anybody can lay a complaint. So often what happens is that people get their knickers in a knot over something, or the relationship has broken down with the customer and the plumber, and so as a way to get around having to pay or get something further, the customer's, I'm going to lay a complaint with the board about you. So to start with, the complaint has to be in writing. So it can be done via the RAC app, the Report a Cowboy app that's on the board's website. It can be done on the board's website by laying a complaint, fill out the forms, or it can be put in writing as a letter to the registrar laying a complaint. Now the complaint has to have sufficient information for the board to actually be able to do something with it. It just can't be about, well, somebody, Joe Bloggs, did something somewhere at some time and it wasn't right. There has to be sufficient information in there. And when the board receives it, it has to pass a couple of hurdles. It's not allowed to be frivolous or vexatious. Now, they're odd words, and it's quite a high threshold to actually meet to determine that something is frivolous, either frivolous or vexatious. And the only way that can really hit those is if it's sorry, I just had a notice pop up. If it's not directly related to the work. The other thing that that sits there is if it's so minor in nature, then the board might dismiss it as well. But effectively, and you need to note this down, you need to get this information. If the registrar takes it on and it goes through the first look to go, well, there's this complaint within our jurisdiction. It's not about electrical work or laying bricks or something. It is about plumbing, gas fitting and drain laying. Then the complaint is given to an investigator, and the investigator makes a preliminary decision on whether it's to be investigated. Information is provided in writing to you if a complaint was about you. Any further information that goes back to the investigator is then taken into consideration, and the investigator either decides to dismiss the complaint, or the complaint proceeds and it goes through to a disciplinary hearing, and it sees itself through that to an outcome of either the board deciding actually there's nothing to see here, or well, we think there is something, but it's best if you just get a warning, or right through to censure, which was a letter explaining how bad things have got, or through to fine or ordering further training is required. So you do need to know that the information around frivolous or vexatious, and that the investigator is appointed and the investigator decides whether the complaint goes through to investigation or not. One thing that the board cannot do is the board cannot order you to pay the homeowner or make reparation. The homeowner has to seek other recourse for that, but the board can issue a fine or order that you undertake further training or something like that. So look, that's been a full hour of me talking on, and I've just had a notice saying this is about to stop. I don't know if anyone's got a quick question they'd like to ask. You've got about a minute to ask it, and I'm not too sure if the whole thing shuts down after that or not, Martin.
No. There's no.
Oh, will it? Okay.
Great effort, Paul.
Yeah, so that's probably about me. Look,